All right, well, I think we can go ahead and get started. So everyone, thank you so much for joining us for the U.S.-India Chamber of Commerce webinar on how to handle stress during this incredibly stressful time, COVID-19. We are seeing and hearing from a lot of our businesses that they are really struggling with very tough decisions that they're having to make. Should they keep their operations open? Should they close their operations? Do they lay off employees? And all of these, of course, have a lot of consequences for a lot of people, which has caused quite a bit of stress for a lot of our members. And so we wanted to take this time to visit with Dr. Madhukar Trivedi and have him answer some of those questions that we are hearing from our businesses. Dr. Trivedi is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at UT Southwestern Medical Center. He serves as chief of the Division of Mood Disorders and the founding director of the Center for Depression Research and Clinical Care, where he holds the Betty Jo Hay Distinguished Chair in Mental Health and the Julie Hirsch Chair for Depression Research and Clinical Care. He specializes in treating depression. And many of you may have heard him. He's a frequent guest speaker on many of the sort of intellectual circuits. I know I've heard him before on KERA's Think. Many of you may have heard him there as well. Dr. Trivedi earned his medical degree at Baroda Medical College in India, where he also completed a residency in psychiatry. He performed a second residency in psychiatry at the Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, Michigan, and received advanced training in functional brain imaging and psychopharmacology through a research fellowship at UT Southwestern. He has a very long list of accomplishments, but in the interest of time, I will stop there and let you all read about his full biography in the newsletter that goes out through the Chamber or also at the UT Southwestern Medical Center website. So with that, Dr. Trivedi, thank you so much for joining us. I think you may have received a list of the questions that we've been hearing from some of our members. So I think we can kick off the conversation with some of those questions. The first is, how do I know if I'm feeling an extraordinary amount of stress during this time? What's the difference between a normal amount of stress and sort of an abnormal amount of stress? And what are the characteristics and traits of that? And how do I know if I'm dealing with that?
So thank you again for arranging this, and I wish we were doing this under different and better circumstances. I think this is a very interesting question on the one hand. On the other hand, I think we ought to recognize that this is really out of the ordinary. Most people are experiencing significant stress, and in fact, rates of people reporting anxiety and stress is close to 80%. So we shouldn't be surprised that we are feeling the stress. I am feeling stress, and all of us are. I think the key question around this should be, what should we do to try to alleviate some of the stress, put things in perspective, and try to avoid things that we can avoid, and try to actually continue to do things that we should and can do. One of the main things we all end up doing, I do, and I am personally also trying to practice when I'm preaching, and that is we overload ourselves with the news so that there is constant. I just actually got rid of WhatsApp because I am on so many groups and everybody is sending out all this stuff. And so that is the first thing to do. Most people experience stress. This is really frightening because, especially because the threat is unknown. We don't know what the virus is really doing. Why is it so much more fatal than the common flu is not yet clear medically. So this is really, and what in normal circumstance, in other circumstances where there is a lot of stress, like there is a hurricane, there's a tornado, there's a war, even 9/11, we were actually getting together. This is now pulling us apart. So as, you know, even as the president has been saying, generally we try to give money to people so they can go back to work. Instead, here we are not able to do that. So how do we overcome that? So first thing is to really pay attention to where and how much of the news you're acquiring. Try to go restrict it to certain sites, certain places which you respect and trust, and put some discipline on ourselves so that I'm not going to check on how many people died 20 times a day, but maybe once. So that's one thing. Second thing is trying to figure out a way, despite all of this, to maintain some routine. So your time to go to sleep, your time to wake up, even during the daytime. For example, I work from home. I'm now working from home and constantly on email and Zoom, etc. But then I dress up for the day rather than not dress up. So maintain a routine, sleep, pay attention to your nutrition, eat healthy, exercise, because we can obviously not go in a crowd, but still exercise. Do things that really can reduce your stress, because that is really very important.
So there were a couple of things you mentioned in there. One is checking the news, and you also mentioned some of the challenges with social distancing. A couple of, I guess, follow-up questions to that. One is, are there specific news sources that you like to look to, which may be providing a less emotional version of the news, where people can get the information they need, but without the panic or the alarm or the quote unquote added stress that may be coming with some of the news?
So I think at least one thing I do is avoid any news site that is really capitalizing on breaking news, because their task is to create real sort of big news with little things. So I tend to go to either print news or things like PBS NewsHour, etc., where there is a little bit of pause in where and how they report the news, so that it doesn't become, again, every 5 minutes something happens and somebody complains and there is a Twitter feed goes out. So I tend to try to avoid doing. Think of it, if you are normally in your profession, you are not going to have time, for example, to watch CNN during the day. So why take this opportunity to do that is one way of doing it. So I tend to be a lot more selective in where I get the news, and like you said, and different people may have different places where they respect and trust that news. So I'm not making the case that one or the other channel, but any cable news that is really interested in only talking about breaking news and is always tends to be exaggerating.
So another thing you mentioned is, usually in times of high stress, we usually come together as a community or a family or a country. In this particular case, because of the social distancing requirements, we are having to stay apart, and the support we would ordinarily get from each other, we're not able to. Any suggestions on how we can, substitute some of that socializing that may support our well-being during this time when we can't physically be together?
I think one good thing about the current time is that media, access to online sources like Zoom and webinars and FaceTime, etc., has become so much easier that you can create, like you're doing here. I was on a national meeting for 2 days with 300 people on Zoom call. So there is a way that you should try to collect your friends, your family, and do routine, regular check-ins, and not only about, again, the news and about what is happening with social distancing, but about their well-being, about what their day is like, etc. But we can use all the media. We now have easy access to it, because it used to be hard 10 years back. Now it's really easy. Also, a lot of people really, you should check in with your family, kids and grandkids, because they have a little more realistic sense of the world also, and that kind of interaction does not end up having to be only about the virus.
Gotcha. So when people, you mentioned routines, and you specifically mentioned a few routines that you said are enabling sort of a good well-being, which is waking up in the morning, maybe, getting dressed like you're going to the office, sleeping at the same time, trying not to disrupt your routine too much. But one of the challenges that a lot of our business owners and even employees are facing is they're having to run their businesses from home, or from with limited staff, and on top of that, they're also doubling up as a teacher to their children or as a care provider for their children, whereas ordinarily, somebody else would be handling those responsibilities under normal circumstances. Again, how would you suggest that people cope with those types of added responsibilities, which were not part of their previous routine, but are now part and parcel of their routine?
So I think two things. One is we have to remember that often as parents, I did that as a parent myself, often as parents, we tend to be feeling so much under pressure that every moment, every day, every grade is so important. Take it a little easier with the kids. They are not going to totally lose everything they have learned. This is sort of a semi-unfortunate vacation, and so if they end up not studying as much as you want, that is fine, because otherwise you're adding more stress to yourself and to the kids. I think the employer-employee part is really hard, and I suspect a lot of the members of the chamber are really in that middle group, that they are too big to get really help from the government or from others, and not as big as the big corporations where they can weather it. And for them, the stress and anxiety of almost fear of losing the business or having to fire employees is tough. And I think that is one place where this kind of a group, where like-minded people, maybe you can develop a group chat or a group Zoom with people who are dealing with it, may not immediately solve the problem of the business itself, but at least there is a time and place where you can share your stress and your concerns, and somebody else may also be dealing with it. Probably a lot better than doing it by yourself sitting at home, because it is scary. And I think that some of the businesses will end up having real hard times. So we cannot sort of put it away as that is going to be a reality for some.
Yeah. So kind of following up on that, I think a lot of people wonder, when do I get a sense for, there's sort of the normal stress, the healthy stress of, preparing for some tough situations, but those are part of everyday life. And then you have this abnormal stress, of course, caused by situations like this. And then you have, mental health, challenges, diseases, disorders that might start to pop up under these extreme pressure situations. How do you help somebody determine at what point they may be moving over from a high stress situation into more of a mental health related concern that may need professional evaluation and assistance?
I think that if any of these things, like we talked about the breakage in the routine, if you try to go back and force yourself to have the routine and yet it doesn't work, you say, I'm going to go to sleep at 9 or 10. And yet when you go there, instead of falling off to sleep, it takes too long to sleep, or you wake up in the middle of the night, or you start having palpitations, etc. Those are signs where you may want to get some external help. And there are different places I've started thinking about how to do it. So for example, UT Southwestern, our Department of Psychiatry is now offering a helpline for any employee at UT Southwestern. who is experiencing overly stress and or anxiety or depression or thoughts of suicide, etc. There are similar other online resources where you can call a doctor and actually have a conversation. Most of the health insurance companies are also approving your program, sort of plan, the insurance plans, doctors, both primary care as well as psychiatry, psychology, to now see you online, even if you have never seen them in person, including Medicare, but Blue Cross, Anthem, others are also doing that. So find out from your insurance company who you can call, and they have opened up the chance, and they're actually encouraging people to call if they need. So first is if your routine, your sleep, appetite, your physical health starts experiencing any changes, you should actually seriously consider calling somebody for at least a consultation online. The second part is, I think, trying to also make sure you're avoiding things like in this period, alcohol consumption, for example, has already gone up nationally. So restricting alcohol consumption may also be another way to avoid some of the negative effects.
So just to summarize what you just said, if somebody is experiencing any significant changes to their sleep patterns, their appetite, their physical health in general during this time, you're saying that they should probably, would it be best to consult their primary care physician first?
If they already have a primary care physician, they should call them.
Okay.
And either the primary care physician will be able to online have a consultation with you, or because they are not, or some of the primary care physicians don't deal with mental health issues, then they will have a referral source that they can send you to, and you call them and set up an appointment as if you are going to see a doctor and get a consultation.
And now you can do that online through telemedicine expansion.
Correct.
Great.
All healthcare providers and insurance companies have now been given permission. In fact, I also do some drug abuse research. For the longest time, medications for people who have opioid use disorder, those medications were scheduled, and so that you couldn't actually send them to the patients, but now they're allowing that. So I think this, in an indirect way, is beginning to change healthcare, how it is delivered. I can see that in 5 years, 50 to 60% of clinical visits will be virtual and not in person. So you should start using it, especially if the stress is something that is leading to fights or irritability, and you're having a lot of tussle with your spouse or your family. That is another sign that the stress is too much, and you should get a consultation.
Gotcha. I know we mentioned that, this is what people should do if they start to notice these types of changes in their sort of general physical health and mental health. What types of disorders or mental health diseases come out primarily from stress? What are some of the, if there were, say, top 5 that are triggered by stress, what would those be? And how can people start to, even in spouses or older parents or children, what can they start to look for in that, where they can identify those types of things for their family?
So first is the group of people who have experienced really clinical depression or anxiety disorder before. For that group, actually, there is a higher risk when these things happen. But even those who have not had, the most common things people experience with significant stress is anxiety, like a significant anxiety, almost where you cannot escape it at any given time. So therefore, you're always feeling like there's a pit in your stomach, or you're having butterflies in your stomach, and you cannot, and your heart is racing, and your mouth is dry, etc. The second is depression, and third is people end up overusing alcohol. Those are the three most common things people experience when they have a lot of stress.
Gotcha. So we're coming to the end of sort of our formal question session. I want to open it up to questions from our participants. So all of if you have any specific questions for Dr. Trivedi, you can ask it in the Q&A box at the bottom of the webinar or in the chat box. Either one is okay. We'll start opening it up for questions here in about 5 minutes. So start thinking about any specific questions that you might have, and we will open those questions up to Dr. Trivedi to answer. So Dr. Trivedi, right before we kind of end the sort of formal portion of our program, what if anything would you say? I know you mentioned routine, maintaining a good routine during this time. Another thing you mentioned is just taking maybe a few minutes a day to observe your physical health, your mental health, your relationships, checking in on other family members. So kind of doing a quick self-check, if you will. And then you mentioned making sure that you're taking time to check on your social relationships, to check on other people's well-being as well during this time. Keeping up with the news, but maybe not terribly frequently. Any other, just tips that you can offer? I know a lot of people are engaged in things like meditation, yoga. Are there any mental health benefits? I know a lot of times people tout mental health benefits for those practices. Would you maybe speak on that? And then any other suggestions you have for business leaders during this time?
Sure. So exercise is one thing that I would add to all the others, but yes, meditation at least has been studied, and it clearly shows improvement in stress and anxiety, has been repeatedly shown. So if you have the experience or have practiced meditation before, then I think you want to double down and clearly put that part of your routine in a day. Yoga has been studied, but less so. But again, it is a form of exercise, so that would be something that you should think about. If you are used to yoga as opposed to running or jogging, then do yoga. So both yoga and meditation have, especially meditation. And I know some of the members of the chamber are also have actually years of experience with meditation. So that is something to really redo. It is also worthwhile thinking about really engaging with places of worship, because now a lot of temples and churches and other religious organizations are doing virtual lectures and seminars, and so that is the other place to try to engage with. There is also possible, it is harder in the current circumstances, but there are avenues, and that is trying to do something for other people, donate your time in some other way. That still can be done safely so that you're not engaging in crowd activity, but that can be done so that it feels like you're giving back to somebody.
So with that, any final thoughts before we sort of close out for the, before we open it up to Q&A?
I think that this is scary, but I think that if we are careful, then we can weather it.
Yes, I would agree with you. And I think, thankfully our government's also coming along with a lot of support mechanisms, at least financial support mechanisms during this time. The House just passed the CARES Act. The Senate had passed it earlier this week, and it looks like the president will probably sign it today. That is going to offer a lot of financial support, particularly to small and medium-sized businesses with less than 500 employees. A lot of wage support mechanisms in there, payroll support, unemployment insurance was, of course, increased during this period of time already by the last bill. We're also seeing a lot of low interest loans and also forgivable loans, which could potentially be converted into grants. So I think hopefully that will start to ease some of the financial stress that I know a lot of business leaders have been facing. So I want to thank you for sharing your thoughts with all of us. And I want to open it up to questions that anyone might have from the audience. Again, you can type those questions into the Q&A box at the bottom. And also you can type those into the chat if you would like to. Madhukar, Dr. Trivedi, we have a question here. Can we provide a resource to those caregivers who are at home caring for a loved one whose resources may have likely become limited, loss of income, a home care provider, supplies, etc., who are already under tremendous stress? It is notable that they are susceptible already to caregiver burnout, isolation, and depression.
So again, that is a little hard in the sense that depends on what their insurance is, but otherwise they should follow the same sort of process that I mentioned, that even though if they are caregivers taking care of people and they're having stress, they should call their primary care physician and talk about it. There are also group activities that they may want to get engaged in where they are talking to other caregivers so that they can discuss this and share in their experiences. But I think caregiver burden is really harder because then they don't get any break under the current circumstances. In fact, I know of somebody whose spouse is extremely ill, and as a result, before this happened, a lot of us were visiting and all. Now, because of the fear that we go, then the spouse will get sicker from us, so we don't go. So then it is all falling on her. So that sort of thing is really absolutely a big concern.
So are there support groups online or any websites that you're aware of for caregiver burnout?
I am not, I will search through and email you. I'm not personally aware. I think there are charitable organizations that give sliding scale therapy and counseling, like the Catholic Charities, etc. In your area, you can find somebody and engage with them, and they can provide it.
Okay. And yes, if you forward those resources to me, we will make sure to send them out in our Chamber's newsletter. Any other questions from our audience today on how to deal with? So let me ask you a question in this. So, you know, one of the things we heard a lot about yesterday from some of our business owners is that the sort of emotional stress of having to make tough financial decisions. Of course, business owners are always in the position of, you know, they're responsible both for their employees, and they recognize that by paying them a salary, they're allowing or enabling their employee to take care of their employee's family. But in these types of situations where customers are not walking through the door, and you know, that there may be a loss of revenue, there may be other, you know, financial challenges that may cause them to make the decision to lay somebody off or let someone go. Can you talk to us a little bit about, you know, the emotion of guilt and how that can contribute to stress here? And what are some ways that people can think about the current situation so that maybe they can try to, their perspective that they bring to it can help them to alleviate some of the mental agony they may be experiencing with some of the tough decisions they're having to make?
Right, and I think that you're seeing this repeatedly in many stories coming out, even in the news, and that is, especially small business employers, when they have few employees, they feel like they're part of their family, but there is only so much they can do, and they may have to let go, and it makes them feel very guilty and all. I think two groups of people at that point can help. Three groups. One is people in your family, although they are also kind of intimately engaged, so they may not have the bandwidth to help. But your peers who are also experiencing the same thing may be able to actually give you their perspective, because they may also have had to do the same. So you at least understand each other, and that is one group that can help support. And the other is well, a lot of people also have friends who are not in the small business community, who are close friends, and they can also be the group that can help you recognize that you are not doing this out of spite. If you have to let go, at some point, that is the nature of small business.
Right.
Because and it is very hard for the employer, especially with few employees, to remember that while yes, it is important to help the employees and their families, but that is only possible if your business is still existing. So at some point, those decisions have to be made.
Right. So talk to us a little bit more about your work in mood disorders and clinical research. Help us understand a little bit more about what you do and what your Center for Clinical Depression does.
So my work is it really has been broad. I've been interested in trying to understand the causes and treatments for depression. That's sort of been my goal, and I have studied a lot. But over the last 15 years, my real focus has been, the core is to be able to develop blood and brain tests so that we can use them to identify people who have depression, because there's a lot of people, like you were saying, how do I know I have stress that needs attention? Similarly, for depression, it isn't something that people kind of have immediately aware that they have depression. They know there is something the matter. They are not doing well with their spouse. They're not doing well at work. They can't sleep, but there's not a label. So as a result, half the people with depression don't ever get diagnosed. Of the people who get diagnosed, half of them don't get treated. So what I am interested in is developing these brain and blood tests so that we can do a test, and then it becomes easier to diagnose and then easier to treat. The second part that I'm really focused on is early identification, because there is a 10 to 12 year gap between when somebody experiences something and they get diagnosed. And during that time, the brain circuits are actually negatively affected. There's toxicity in the brain. So what I do is try to get early diagnosis, so that my goal has been that all primary care physicians, pediatricians, OB/GYN specialists should routinely screen for depression, anxiety. And thirdly, which is the biggest challenge, but I'm dedicated to doing that, and that is developing these tests in young people before they ever get an anxiety or depression, so that we can put in place protective, preventive measures so that we can reduce their chances of getting depressed or anxious.
I'm just looking at the list of people who are joining us today, and many of them come from the South Asian community. And I know one of the conversations you and I have had, outside of this medium is the fact that many South Asian families overlook the significant number of young South Asian Americans with mental health challenges going through our school system, our public school system. Can you talk to us? This is a good time where families are spending a lot more time with their children at home. So it's sort of a, kind of a pause on everyday life. But, can you talk to us about some, some of the stats that you're seeing within the South Asian community, maybe anecdotal or otherwise, and then, what can families do if they believe that maybe their child is struggling with this, or how can we make sure that they're not overlooking a challenge if their child may be struggling with one?
So first and foremost, facts. There are a lot of people actually in my social circle, in our circle, ask me that when they hear about depression, anxiety, suicides in American kids, they said, isn't it interesting we don't have the same degree of problem in our community? And I tell them that that is not true. Being Indian or Asian does not protect you from having depression, anxiety. That the rates of depression, anxiety, even in India, are high. It just gets ignored. So our kids, in fact, have an additional burden, and that is we are often the first, second generation immigrants, and so the pressure on them to succeed is profound. So one thing we should do as parents is give them permission to talk about it, because often I hear from teens and young people that they don't feel like they have permission to be telling their parents that I feel depressed or I have some problem, because that is the first thing to do. And the second is, I think if you see any signs that suggest a big change, they've lost their friends, they're becoming less social, they're not engaging in as many fun, pleasurable activities, they're not sleeping right, do not write off that behavior as teenage behavior, but take them to the pediatrician for screening.
So, while we're on the topic of sort of parental support of children, right now, a lot of parents are getting to spend that extraordinary amount of time with their kids at home. What are some good ways of broaching these types of tough conversations with children where you do have, a teenager at home who is not generally, who doesn't generally open up to you? You may or may not be aware of any challenges they are having, or maybe they don't have any challenges, but what's a good way of spending some of this time to understand and understand what's going on in their world? What are some good approaches?
So first thing, even if they don't have depression, anxiety, first thing is obviously this gives us a time and opportunity to spend time with them on fun activities that are not focused on their study and not necessarily focused on negative things. So that is one thing, to spend more time with games, fun, walks, etc. The second thing, which is a different end of it, and that is, do not be afraid to ask them directly, not confrontationally, but just in a normal dinner conversation, if any of them have had any experiences with depression, anxiety. There's also safer ways to do it, although if you are afraid or if it becomes awkward, is you can ask them, do they know any kids who have this? Because that it opens the door for them to say, I don't know, yes, but I also experienced this. So making it so that it is not seen in a negative light and keeping the conversation open is probably the best way to do it. If you directly confront, it often is hard for the teen to guess.
So just to follow up to that, are there certain words like, using the word anxiety, depression, these are sort of charged words. But sometimes kids don't always think in those terms. They don't think, oh, I'm depressed today, or I have anxiety today. What are some common words that they use, or even that adults use, that kind of get at those ideas, but maybe are more common in our everyday vernacular?
So for teens, one of the cardinal symptoms that occurs is they remain angry and irritable. They are always on a short fuse. And if you see that, then not immediately when you see them throw a tantrum, but at a later point, pointing out that I see this is happening. Are you okay? Is there something bothering you? Is there something I can do? I see that you're not going out with the friends you were last year. You're now a lot of time by yourself. Is there anything happening? Is another way to do it. But, and if that becomes again difficult for some parents, it is, then saying to the teen, I'm going to suggest we go and see a pediatrician, is another option.
Mm-hmm.
Although again, during this time, it's a little harder, but I'm talking about generally.
Got it. So I think we're, coming up on about 45 minutes here. We have a couple of suggestions from one of our participants today, a couple of resources that may be helpful for individuals. The first is Here for Texas. It's through the www.here, spelled out, .com. And it's a great local resource as it serves as an overall mental health navigation tool with a phone-in option. So I think you mentioned hotlines and phone-in options. So if you know anybody who's struggling during this time, coping up with all of the various responsibilities, that's a great navigation tool. And then there was another one that was suggested here that's helpful for moving body and breath work, exercises and breathing guidance for anxiety and stress management relief. And this is through Harvard, and it's www.health.harvard.edu/staying-healthy/exercising-2-relax. And it may be very supportive and helpful for people to start down this path. And we will send these resources out on Monday with a recording of our webinar today. And so with that, Dr. Trivedi, any final parting thoughts before we close for the afternoon and for the weekend?
I think be careful, be vigilant, but being overly frightened is not makes it worse. So trying to distract yourself with some of the things we talked about is probably the best option.
Well, thank you so much for your time. And
thank you.
If you do come across any other resources, please feel free to send those over to me and we'll make sure to get those out to our members. And for everyone on the call today, we hope you're staying safe and COVID-free. And we are here to answer any business-related questions that you might have. As many of you know, you can find out all the information about the webinars we host on through our chamber newsletter. And you can subscribe to our newsletter from our website, www.usicoc.org. There we are posting about all the most current news and information that we are receiving about resources for businesses to cope and work through this situation, COVID-19. And then also we are posting information about upcoming webinars there. So on Monday at 10 a.m., we'll be hosting a tax webinar with USICOC member company, My Tax Filer. They will be walking us through a lot of the provisions that will be impacting small businesses from a tax standpoint. They will also be helping our small businesses think through some of those payroll questions. Should I furlough employees, or should I lay them off, or should I keep them on payroll? All of those tough questions that may be causing stress. We'll be working through those from the financial point of view on Monday at 10 a.m. So we welcome all of you to join us for that webinar. And then on Wednesday of next week, we will be touching base on the HR issues. So what are the differences between furloughing and laying somebody off? What are the implications of that from an unemployment standpoint? What is COBRA benefits? How does that impact the employee, and how does that impact you as an employer? So all of those questions will be answered on Wednesday by a number of experts in the field of human resources, organizational development, and then on Friday we'll be picking up with yet another webinar, and that one will be on contract law, what to think about if you have breaches of contracts, as a result of COVID-19 from vendors, suppliers, or if you're not able to deliver any on your contracts with others on your end of the bargain and contracts, what can you be thinking about or doing during this time to minimize or mitigate your liability and your losses? And so we hope that you'll join us for those webinars next week. And then we will also, coming out of this webinar today, we may do a Zoom call, schedule a Zoom call for next week to check in on all of our members and have it be a little bit more interactive where employers can share some of their challenges. So we will look into providing that support resource for the program. So with that, I want to thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. And again, if there are any topics that we can help to provide you with experts and information on, please email us. You can email us at info@usicoc.org, or you can email me directly at president@usicoc.org. So with that, thank you so much. And we will close for the...
You need water.
Thank you all. Have a great weekend.
Thanks a lot.